All right, today we are diving into a really interesting research paper. It's got a pretty bold title, Presenting a Qualitative God to a Quantitative World. And it really gets right to the heart of a question that, seems to pit two completely different worlds against each other.
So let's just ask it straight up. Is it irrational for a scientist to believe in God? I mean, the common assumption, right, is that science and faith are just fundamentally at odds. You have to pick a side. But what if that's not the whole story? This paper, it explores a totally different perspective, and it really challenges that entire idea.
So the paper zeroes in on this very specific, very interesting group of people, 10 credentialed scientists. We're talking people with advanced degrees, most with doctorates, who all had one thing in common. They started their careers as committed atheists.
And here's the court argument, the big claim of the paper. It wasn't some rejection of science that led them to faith. Actually, it was the very practice of science itself. So what we're going to do for the next few minutes is kind of act like investigators. We're going to walk through the three distinct lines of evidence this paper puts forward and just see where it takes us.
Okay, so the author builds their case using what they call a triangulated research design. Now that sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. It just means they combine three very different kinds of evidence. You've got personal stories, you've got hard math, and you've got medical case studies. And the whole argument is that all three of these totally separate lines of inquiry, well, they all point to the exact same conclusion.
So let's start with that first line of evidence, the human element, the personal revelations. These are the actual stories of those 10 scientists who used to be atheists.
Let's take Dr. Francis Collins, for example. This is the guy who led the Human Genome Project. The paper says that as he studied physics and just how incredibly, precisely fine-tuned the constants of our universe are, the things that have to be just right for us to even exist, he came to this really startling conclusion. He said that his own atheism was, and I'm quoting here, the least rational of the options.
And we see a really similar story from astrophysicist Dr. Sarah Salviander. The paper presents her testimony, which says that the more she studied the cosmos, the more she came to see the universe not as some random, chaotic accident, but as something with this deep, underlying order that was just, too elegant to be a coincidence.
And this story just brilliantly illustrates a common thread that runs through all of these accounts. The paper brings up the case of Justin Brooke, who, get this, actually set out to disprove Christianity. He wanted to debunk it. But his deep dive into cosmic fine-tuning and the sheer complexity of DNA, it led him to the exact opposite conclusion he was looking for. So the author of the paper looked at all 10 of these stories and found that these 4 core themes kept popping up again and again. And what's wild is that these scientists never collaborated. They came to these conclusions on their own. The crucial point, the paper argues, is that for every single one of them, their scientific work led them to believe that the insane precision of the universe just kind of negates random chance, and that a creator was actually the most rational explanation they could find.
Okay, so the personal stories all share this common theme of seeing design in the universe. The paper's second pillar then tries to put some numbers on that feeling. This brings us to the mathematical element, the argument from improbability. We're shifting gears now from human experience to pure numbers.
Now, to really get this argument, we need a baseline. The paper pulls from the work of mathematicians who tried to define what impossible actually means, statistically speaking. They basically say an event is statistically impossible if the odds of it happening by chance are 1 in 10 to the 50th power. So that's a 1 with 50 zeros after it. Just try to picture that. And keep that number in your head. Now, look at this number. This is the paper's calculated odds of just one single complex protein, hemoglobin, the stuff in your blood, forming by random chance. That's a 1 followed by over 1,000 zeros. So when you compare that to our benchmark for impossible, this number isn't just unlikely. The paper argues it's so far beyond impossible that it's just not in the realm of comprehension. So this whole mathematical framework leads to a concept the paper really highlights called complex specified information, or CSI. The easiest way to think about it is like this. If you just spill a bunch of Scrabble tiles on the floor, that's complex, but it's random. But the words in a book? That's complex and it's specified. It follows a pattern, it carries a message. The paper argues that DNA is like that book. It contains this incredible code that it argues natural causes alone just can't generate. It is important for us to note, though, that this idea of CSI is a pretty debated and, frankly, controversial idea within the wider scientific community. Okay, this brings us to the third and final line of evidence, which might be the most unusual one, the medically unexplained. Here, the author looks at 3 peer-reviewed studies on something called proximal intercessory prayer, or PIP, which is basically just a formal way of saying prayer for healing, delivered in person.
All right, the first case comes from a paper published in Complementary Therapies and Medicine. It involved a young man who had a severe, incurable stomach condition since birth. For 16 years, his entire life, he was completely dependent on a feeding tube just to get nutrition.
So, after receiving prayer, the study reports that he was able to eat normally. All of his symptoms just resolved. The feeding tube was removed, and years later, he was still symptom-free. Now, the original researchers who published the study, they noted but a sudden, complete resolution of his condition is, medically speaking, unprecedented. It just doesn't happen.
The second case is from the Explore Journal. It details a woman who was diagnosed with juvenile macular degeneration and had been blind for 12 years. Now, this condition has no known clinical treatment, and according to the study's authors, there are no known cases of it ever spontaneously recovering on its own.
The study reports that her vision was regained instantaneously after prayer and, get this, remained stable for the next 47 years. The original researchers actually described this case as being completely unique in the literature.
And the final study from the Southern Medical Journal. This one was different because it wasn't just a single case. This involved 24 people in rural Mozambique who had hearing and vision problems and, importantly, no access to conventional medicine. After receiving prayer, they showed statistically significant improvements, and the average visual improvement was more than 10-fold.
So we have these 3 very different threads, right? The personal stories, the mind-boggling math, and the medically documented healings. So how does the paper connect them all? Well, the heart of its argument is this idea of convergence, that these totally independent lines of evidence all unintentionally seem to point in the very same direction.
And all of this leads us to the paper's final, overarching conclusion. Based on this alleged convergence of evidence, the author proposes what they call a substantive theory, that an intelligent creator offers the most rational and coherent explanation for, well, for reality, for the universe's fine-tuning and the origin of life itself.
Now, let's be really clear here. The paper makes a very strong case for what it calls unintentional corroboration. But to its credit, it also explicitly acknowledges its own limitations. The author notes that, look, personal stories are by nature subjective, and that in the medical studies, just because there's a correlation between prayer and healing doesn't definitively prove that one caused the other.
And so, the paper leaves us with this really challenging question. It doesn't claim to have absolute proof, but it does present this really curious convergence. So the question is, when personal experience and mathematical probability and documented medical events all seem to point in the same, seemingly impossible direction, what are we supposed to make of that? What does it mean when the qualitative and the quantitative start telling the same story? That's definitely something to think about.